The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
About 6 inches? Is that okay? Okay. Bob, I wonder if we might start off with a couple of biographical questions. As you probably know, when Eugene O'Neill wrote to George Pierce Baker seeking admission to his program in playwriting, he said to him, I want to be a playwright or nothing. Did you want to be a critic or nothing? And if so, when did you decide that, and how did you go about it?
I sidled into criticism. I wasn't born with the impulse and the instinct and the ambition to be a drama critic. Actually, I sidled into most things during my life, but at this point in the early 50s, I was studying under Lionel Trilling at Columbia University, and I was overwhelmed by him and wanted to be him. And he very kindly and generously responded to some writings that I'd done in a seminar and invited me to write some pieces for Commentary magazine, which at that time was rather more responsive to rational thought than it is at the present time. And I did so in 1953 with a short book review of Saturday Evening Post stories, very far afield from the theater, and then did not publish there again because I was working on a doctorate and also acting and directing in the theater until 1957, when I did a longish piece on what I call the inarticulate hero in American life, which was an attempt to establish the fact that acting had changed and our perceptions of movie heroes had changed and stage heroes with the advent of Marlon Brando and a host of imitators. And that article attracted some attention. Meanwhile, I was more interested in practical theater, even though I was pursuing my academic career. And oddly enough, a friend of mine who was in the theater at the time said, why don't you become a critic, and then it'll be easier for you to be an actor. I didn't follow the logic at the time, but I think that helped me to fall into this very peculiar and precarious position known as a drama critic. I began writing some pieces for Harper's Magazine, and from there I was invited to write for the New Republic in 1959, where I've been off and on for 23 years.
In this program, I think they've had several critics who write for newspapers on a more daily and frequent basis than you do. I wonder if you could describe a little bit the difference between the kind of criticism you do and what is done, say, every other day in the New York Times.
Well, the kind of criticism I do is easier because I have more time to do it. I admire and envy writers who can turn out a piece of prose in an hour and a half, almost instantly after seeing a show on the stage. I don't have that particular gift. It takes me 3 to 4 days to write a review, and I'm not happy with it then. But I think I do have an advantage over the instantaneous drama critic, and that is, of course, the obvious advantage of reflection. I have time to think more about what I've seen, but more than that, I don't have to writing in a weekly magazine with a rather small circulation. I do not feel the obligation in my criticism to say go see it or don't go see it. In other words, I don't have to function as a consumer's guide. Whereas I think the various newspaper reviewers, and particularly the very good reviewer for the New York Times, does have this obligation. People read them the next morning and want to know whether they should go see Cats or Good or whatever the show is. And of course, the thing we look for in his review, no matter how lively the review may be, we do look for that judgment. We want to know what he thought, or more accurately, we think, what does the New York Times think about this particular play or movie or concert? I don't feel that kind of responsibility, happily, and I'm relieved of that responsibility, And as a result, I can concentrate on other aspects of the evening, other aspects of the performance, which interest me more. And while I'm obliged to give a judgment, I don't think people would read me if I didn't ultimately give some kind of judgment. I don't consider it the most important aspect of my criticism, and I hope I'm not required to survive or fall into oblivion on the basis of whether I liked this or didn't like that, though I hope my judgments are accurate.
Also, you don't have to review everything that you see. You can be selective in that regard.
Yes, that's a great advantage. I do choose very carefully what I go to see. I have to choose it carefully because I come all the way from Boston to review it. I will come down, say, on a Saturday and see a matinee in the afternoon and an evening performance, and I will have to choose in advance what I think would interest me. And if I've missed something, I can come back and see that. But I am in no obligation, as I've tried to make clear, of reviewing that instantaneously the next morning. I can wait a month or 2 months before I go and see something that has been attracting people's attention.
One question I think everyone would want to know is, how do you make your judgments? What are the criteria that you use? Do you have a set, fixed standard, or do you change from show to show? What's the basis of your judgments in the theater?
I have two indelible and generally dependable reactions. One is rage, and the other is a tingle that goes up and down my spine that it's impossible to describe, but when that tingle comes, I know I'm in the presence of something I think is important, and then it's my obligation to analyze my tingle and try to find out why I had it. I can sometimes have a false tingle. Sometimes I can even go see the very same production and have a tingle one night and no tingle the next. And that's why, as I think I'm trying to communicate to you, I do distrust opinions a great deal, even or especially my own. So I also bring certain background and equipment and reading and learning and all that sort of thing, and comparative knowledge to the works I'm seeing. But the hard thing and the important thing is to receive, as it were, an emotional reaction, the tingle, as I'm watching the production without losing my mind, without losing my reason, so that that reason, as it were, can be playing on the event, analyzing it, responding to it as well. If you're just using your reason, you're not going to respond the way a spectator should respond to the theater. If you're just giving yourself up to an oceanic emotion, then you're also not doing your job, because very frequently the most swamping and emotional feelings you can have in the theater may be the falsest. That very frequently is the case. So what I do is I take voluminous notes while I'm watching in order to avoid being totally absorbed in it, because my instinct is to be absorbed in it.
Harold Clurman, I think, once wrote that whether a critic is good or bad doesn't depend on his opinions, but on the reasons he gives for those opinions. And I know you wrote an article once expressing fairly similar sentiments.
Clurman also quoted Heinrich Heine very tellingly, to the effect that the people who built cathedrals in the Middle Ages had convictions. We don't build cathedrals anymore because we don't have any more convictions, we only have opinions. I think it's very important for us, and very important for a critic, to try to find out what his convictions are, if he or she has any, and to write out of that conviction. And it's more important, it seems to me, to maintain that identity, the identity of conviction, throughout a career, than to be right or wrong about a particular play. Because what happens to you when you practice criticism over a long time is you begin willy-nilly to assume that your opinions are more important than the thing you're watching. You develop a certain self-importance, even a certain portentousness, especially when people are hanging on that opinion. And I think it's very, very important, even essential, that one somehow find a way to maintain humility. And one way is to try to determine what your conviction is rather than your opinion.
Also, if you're writing from a set of convictions, if you have passionately felt point of view, I think you're going to tend to do more interesting writing than if you're just mechanically and habitually giving off opinions. Voltaire was wrong about Shakespeare, but his essays are still interesting because they reflected Voltaire's own convictions, his own point of view. T.S. Eliot didn't think much of Othello, but the essay is interesting to read because T.S. Eliot wrote it.
Same thing with Bernard Shaw, who was wrong 3 times out of 4
Right.
in his opinions. We still value him as one of our best drama critics because we don't go back to him to see whether he was right or wrong about, say, Oscar Wilde's importance of being earnest, but what he had to say about that particular play in his time and as part of some even larger universal idea. That's, I think, what we respond to in a critic over time, even though it's not what we respond to immediately. I think that's the kind of distinction I'm trying to make between the daily critic and the weekly critic, that we are, as weekly critics, we hope to be read at some future time, not for our opinions, whereas I think the daily critic, quite frankly, and I think even humbly, accepts the fact that he will not be read, except the next morning, where people will determine whether that play is going to run or not going to run, whether the actor was acceptable to this particular critic or not acceptable, and most important, whether I, as a spectator, am going to shell out $40 a seat plus babysitting money and the cost of parking the car and that extraordinarily expensive restaurant that we can't get into to go to this particular play. I mean, you can buy 2 or 3 shares of IBM stock for what it costs you to go to the theater these days.
But of course, one of the things that make daily and even weekly reviewing more fun to read than what we think of as scholarship or academic writing is that it does have the immediacy and spontaneity of opinions. And I think so much of the juice that comes to a critic derives from that exhilaration of holding forth his own opinion, of having the power over the actors and the production and so forth.
It's hot, and that's what makes it interesting. I mean, I rush to it.
Right.
I want to read it, especially if it's relatively well written. But it also has, we have to recognize, a certain malign effect as well. That one thing that criticism, especially in the theater, does not recognize sufficiently, and that is that the theater is a very volatile and very evanescent event. It doesn't ever stay the same. I tried to suggest that when I spoke about having a tingle one night and not the next. I was watching the same performance, but the performances weren't the same. I see this in my own theater, that we speak of a bad dress rehearsal leading to a good opening. There is a major difference, fundamental difference between what you can see one night done by the same group of actors, designers, and what have you, and the thing you see the next night. What criticism has to assume is the performance they see is the performance that everyone else is going to see. It's a false assumption, especially when you go to an opening night, and there's no more, there's no event that is less true to itself, more unreal than the opening night of a play. Everyone is on edge. Everyone's either overacting or underacting, or they're on quaaludes or uppers or downers or something. And you are not seeing the performance that presumably hundreds of thousands of other spectators will see if that play survives. So critics are not accurate barometers, cannot be accurate barometers for everybody else. And if I can do one thing tonight that's of value, it is to make the point that there are many opinions to be had about any work of theater, including the one that the spectator has himself or herself. And one of the unfortunate things about the American theater today is it is so dependent on the judgments of critics. It should liberate itself in some way from the critics and give itself back to you, the spectators.
In this way, it's really unique among all the arts. I mean, you would never hear of a novel or a film or a TV program being withdrawn because it got a bad notice in the New York Times. It'd be unheard of. And there aren't box scores that list what happens to a novel when it comes out.
But that used to be true. It's becoming less true. Publishing is falling into a show business syndrome now. We used to think if you wrote a book, no matter what anyone thought of it, the book was there. It was permanent. But it's no longer permanent. The books now, if they're not selling, they get shredded. They tear off the covers and shred them, and there's no sign of that book.
But still, the brief quote in the ad or the brief quote on the marquee, it has a power in the theater that it doesn't even have in the other arts.
Exactly.
Does that make the theater reviewer inherently in a more compromised position? The chances for corruption being much greater.
I think the commercial theater is in a very compromised position, and I think if I can speak of it, what I think of as its low quality over the last 10 years is in direct proportion to the situation it stands vis-a-vis criticism. There is an alternative to commercial theater, which some of us have been trying to evolve over the last 20 years, and that is a theater that does not depend on criticism, in which the audience comes to establish a relationship with the people on the stage, not just to go to see a hit or a flop, but to identify themselves with an institution, as you would go to the New York Public Theater, for example, to see Joe Papp's work, because you think there's a certain dependability, there's a certain atmosphere, a certain thrust to what he does. Or even better, if you were to go to see, and there isn't one in this city, unfortunately, a permanent company, and watch that company perform in a variety of plays throughout an entire year, to see how those actors transform from part to part, to see how one production that's done by that company is related to and helps to develop the next production, to see how designers develop. You begin to establish almost a personal relationship with that institution. That's a highly different relationship with the theater than you have when you go to one-shots on Broadway and hope for the best.
There's a pressure, don't you think, on the daily reviewers in the newspapers to like a certain amount of the shows. They have to. It's Broadway is a business. They advertise in the paper. I'm sure critics have been fired for simply not liking enough of the shows they've seen, or not liking the ones they've liked enough. That's a terrible kind of pressure to have to work under.
Well, there is also, of course, the rather limiting fact that the arts and culture pages of newspapers are advertised in by the very people who are being evaluated in those newspapers. Now, that's tough. I mean, if someone can say, I'm going to withhold my advertising if you don't stop attacking my plays, as has been said, that can have some kind of an effect on the newspaper and certainly on the critic. I'm not saying that the newspaper will respond to it, but any kind of threat like that is bound to affect something. And it has affected things in the past.
What do you think is happening with the quality of criticism in both the daily and the more occasional press? Do you think it's getting better? Do you think it's changing in any particular way?
It depends on the periodical. I'm impressed by the current criticism from the New York Times. I think Frank Rich is the best daily critic we've had in a long, long time. I think he's honest, and I think he writes a very lively prose. I naturally don't agree with everything he says. I think his horizons are a little limited, but I am impressed by him in a way that I did not expect to be impressed by a daily newspaper reviewer. I don't know how he does it. So there is improvement over the last 20, 25 years of New York Times reviewing. Other places have gone down, I think. Other places seem to be attracting critics who are themselves performers. That's another limitation of criticism, is you begin competing with the performers in various ways, either through your style gets a little overripe, overheated, or you become a famous slasher and you start biting throats and attacking the physical attributes of the poor actors over there who are unable to retaliate. That becomes a kind of performance, especially when the critic begins to appear before you, either in a public forum or on television, and is responded to for his performance. So that's an unfortunate development of criticism, I think, too.
One of the things I think has happened, I don't know whether you'll agree or not, but when you first started out, there were the daily critics very much on one side, and you might call them adversary critics on the other, the people writing for the smaller weekly or monthly publications. And I remember in one article you talked about when Gelber's The Connection came out in 1959, and it was very negatively reviewed by the daily reviewers, and to some extent saved or given a new life by the second nighters. Of course, now maybe their opinion was vindicated, and yours not. But you mentioned the example of McLeish's J.B. as the opposite happening, where it was celebrated until people took a closer look at it. What seems to have happened now, though, with people like Rich and Kroll, Feingold, people of that high caliber now writing for the mass organs, what's happened is that the necessity for the adversary point of view or the function has been abrogated to some degree, I would think. That everything is sort of moved toward the middle, and you don't have the same kind of dialogue, I think, that you had before.
I think there's truth in that. I think the intellectuals like Jack Kroll and Feingold and Frank Rich have entered the mass media, which is to say the mainstream, and that's been an advantage to criticism. It's not a disadvantage. If there was some pearl that was sitting on the ocean floor unrecognized that us minority critics could leap to the defense of, I would bemoan the situation you described, but there isn't.
Well, the disadvantage, though, is that with these people writing for mass circulation publications, there's not as much need for people to read the New Republic and to read the Nation, and to some extent they don't. I mean, I don't, want to insult what you're doing by any means, but I think it's probable that your readership is less. I don't know. I'm not talking about in terms of numbers, but I have the sense that your readership is not what it was in terms of your own influence over not over the theater, but people who take theater seriously. Simply because people don't have to subscribe to those magazines anymore. They can pick up in the New York Times or Newsweek and get an intelligent opinion, and that's not good for people like you and Richard Gilman who are writing for smaller papers.
I think it's true that our readership is not as engaged with us as it used to be when I first started writing for the New Republic, but I would advance a different reason. And it's a lie to what I tried to describe in my opening remarks. I think the people who write for the mass media appeal to people who want to know, who are interested in Broadway and want to know whether they should go see it. Whereas our audiences were generally a more serious audience. It is the serious audience which is turned away from the theater. And turning away from the theater, they are turning away from the serious theater reviewers. So there are times I feel I'm writing in a vacuum. I'm writing for an intelligent reader who is not reading me. I don't know who he or she is, but I continue to write and hope maybe if I collect, maybe they'll come to the piece then. But there is a real problem that there was a time in the 60s when virtually everybody was writing drama criticism. Susan Sontag was writing drama criticism, Elizabeth Hardwick was writing drama criticism, Eric Bentley. Really first-rate minds were attracted to drama criticism in the New York Review, and Partisan Review, and Hudson Review. You find that nowhere anymore. There's no drama criticism at all, or theater criticism at all, carried in the New York Review. Partisan Review hasn't had a theater chronicle for 15 to 20 years. I'm not sure about Hudson Review. John Simon used to write for that. Does he still write for it?
Occasionally, I believe. Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make is serious people of some intelligence and literary sensibility have written off the theater. And I think it's very important for us minority critics to advance the reasons why they should still be interested in the theater. And what we have to posit is a theater.
There has to be a theater.
There has to be a theater. It's one of the reasons I think it's one of the reasons I left criticism and went into trying to create a theater. I wanted to help make a theater that serious people would respond to.
Eric Bentley once said fairly recently, the standards of the theater are so low that the talents of a critic are not called for. And he went on to compare what was being done in poetry, fiction, film, to the quality of what's being done in the theater. So,
but the funny thing is that even the worst play on Broadway, being in time and being in society, being in a social context, a social universe, tells us more about who we are and what we are, negatively, if you like, by virtue of what it doesn't do, than any movie or any other performing art. Certainly more than dance, which is virtually abstract. And I think if critics can, as some of us try to do, put that awful play in the context, not of whether you're going to enjoy it, but of what kind of lives we're all leading and why this play should erupt at this particular time in our history, I think then we can excite and attract you and give you different reasons for examining the theater. Because the theater is still like a sponge. It just soaks up all the issues and problems and discontents of the time. It has to. And because it's embodied in living people up there who are subject to accident and risk, it's very much in history. It's very much in time. It's not canned. It's not in the past. It's happening. That actor is affected by what happened that day, and you have to be affected by that affect.
We were talking at dinner before we came over about the element of risk that you have in the theater that you don't have in any other form of art, where everything is already set. A painting is done, a book is done. In the live performing arts, you have that element of risk, of not knowing exactly what's going to happen. You don't know how far a performance is going to be carried to the limit, beyond the limit. Is it going to fail? How daring is the attempt? And that's something special in the theater.
And I would like to speak at this moment for the heroic nature of actors, particularly American actors. They are some of the most heroic people I know. Also, they're easily corruptible and they can be very opportunistic. We know that about them. But to get up there on that stage and subject themselves to us, the audience, to us, the critics, night after night, and to get back up there after a terrible drubbing or a terrible panning, or even after being praised to the skies, that's almost as difficult, is a genuinely heroic and adventurous thing to do. They're great people.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, since you've written about it so much, is the integrity of the critic, the moral integrity that he has to maintain. We've already talked to some extent about the commercial pressures that might compromise a critic. There are also social ones. You must encounter them all the time with having to review people that you have taught and that you know personally. And in the theater world, where everyone seems to know everyone else, it must be very difficult to maintain any kind of objectivity there.
I used to worry about Harold Kloeman's criticism. I respected him enormously, and still do. He was an extraordinary critic, but I remember looking at his criticism and saying, why wasn't he tougher? Is it because he was so familiar with everyone that he was reviewing? And here I am. I know, I would say, a good half of the people I have to review. At least I've met them. Many of them I've taught. Many of them I've worked with. And how do you do it? I happen to be lucky in being physically removed from the center of controversy. I'm up in Boston, so I can hit and run. But it does chasten you. You don't attack. I don't attack actors anymore, even the ones I don't know. You talk about an actor's work in context, if you can, of his other or her other performances. And it may fall short, it may rise above, but you cannot make a fundamental judgment on an actor on the basis of that one play, and you must not. That is a crime against the theater.
Shaw said, if my father were an actor-manager and his life depended on his getting a good notice, I would orphan myself tomorrow if his performance was not acceptable.
He was orphaned. He didn't put much stake in his father. He sent his mother into the fray, as I remember.
It seems to me that your criticism has changed somewhat since you've become an artistic director and you've started running a theater, first at Yale and now in Cambridge. Do you think that's true or not?
I think it is true. I think it's partly for that reason, but also partly because of the nature of, I think I've been trying to describe how the nature of the theater has changed. And in order to be intelligent or interesting about the theater, I think the critic has to change. We can't use the same devices and the same judgments and the same standards, of course, but the same approaches as we used to. So I try to say something intelligent about the theater and about a play in the context of the playwright's career when I write a review, and again, not simply slash away.
But it's not just that. I mean, you've mellowed to some extent, haven't you, by being exposed to criticism yourself and understanding what goes into creating a work of art and how vulnerable you can be to criticism in those kinds of situations.
Nobody likes criticism, least of all critics. We are the most tender people in the world. Remember that. I mean, you'll notice this when critics attack other critics or when other critics are criticized, they respond much more tenderly, much more sensitively, and much more angrily. They never forgive than actors do, or directors or designers. They have a way of throwing the water off their backs like ducks, but critics don't.
They can't take criticism.
They can't. We can't take criticism. It's true. But more than that, I've seen what really absolute criticism does to people momentarily, and And if you experience that close up, it's not anything you want to impose.
So in other words, you find yourself pulling back from time to time.
I hope I do, but then I go and look over my reviews, and they seem to me just as irate and just as outraged and just as tough as they were when in the 50s. I keep saying I've mellowed, I keep thinking I've mellowed, and then when I reread my reviews, I haven't mellowed. Being a critic of your own criticism is very difficult.
When Eric Bentley resigned from the New Republic, he was one of your predecessors, he said that he hoped that all critics would resign at the same time and that he would take the lead. He was the only one who resigned at the time, but he hoped everyone would follow him, and his reasoning was that he felt everyone should do it for a while and then get away from it. And your tenure at the New Republic the first time was about 9 years, which was exceptionally long. Most critics that I can think of, Bentley, Shaw, Bierbaum, Tynan, have done it for about 4 or 5 years. They have about the lifespan of a professional lineman in football. They can take so much punishment, and then they have to get out. Do you think that's a good idea to do something else after a while?
Oh, there's no question about it. I think if all you do all your life is practice criticism, I think you're in deep trouble. Because there is a half-life for a critic. I don't know how long it is, whether it's 4 years or 9 years, but there is a life of a critic, and if that's all you do all your life, it changes your nature, it changes your character in ways I don't care to describe. But if criticism is a supplementary action to something else you do, it can be very helpful. It can be refreshing. For me personally, it's a very refreshing thing to leave Cambridge after working 6-7 days a week on a particular production or 2 productions, shake the air of practical theater out of my head and go down to New York or go to Providence or go to Chicago or somewhere where I'm going to look at theater and see someone else's work, and then to spend 2 or 3 days writing about it. It's both agonizing and refreshing, and it's very fulfilling too. I don't know, I'm not satisfied with doing only one thing. I want to do 3, 4, 5 things simultaneously. And I continue to enjoy criticism very much.
One thing I think that most critics feel their responsibility is, as you said before, to tell the audience whether they'll like the play or not. But on another level, it's really to perpetuate and be in sympathy with the values of the critic's audience, to make the audience comfortable with what they're going to see. That is not your aim, certainly.
No, I want to do what the theaters should do, which is to make the audience uncomfortable. I don't think we should be comfortable. And when the theater was at its best, it didn't allow you to be comfortable. It caught the conscience not only of the king, but of the audience.
Walter Kerr said that the best theater provides deep satisfaction and the feeling of being at home.
Well, I don't know what home he's talking about, but...
and you, babe.
Depends on your home.
Right.
But it must not satisfy. It should provide you with a satisfaction, but it's not a satisfaction of the kind I think he's describing. It's a satisfaction of looking at very difficult truths unflinchingly. It's very rare that you find a playwright who's capable of doing that. But those are the great playwrights. That's Shakespeare and Lear, that's O'Neill in Long Day's Journey into Night, that's Ibsen throughout his career, that's Strindberg, that's Chekhov. Those are not comfortable plays, and they don't make you feel at home. Far from it. I mean, after watching King Lear, you don't feel at home. You feel, in fact, very alienated from the universe, as he does. But you also feel a great satisfaction that someone has had the courage to write about this awful, painful thing known as existence.
One of the criticisms I think that has been leveled against critics like yourself for quite a while, and I would include the same group, Bentley, Gilman, Kaufman, Novick, Feingold, all of them, is the feeling that they're not sensitive to some of what is best in our theater, the American musical comedy, which is an important art form in this country, and the feeling that critics like yourself don't really enjoy that kind of entertainment, don't really respond to it, and much more importantly, don't really understand it.
Well, I began as a musician. I didn't go back that far, but I was a musician in a swing band throughout my teens. I played dances. And I've loved music ever since, and my own theater does musical works every year. We lean towards Brecht and Weill. I think that's the greatest musical comedy ever written, the work that they did. We also do operas. We, this year, want to do a musical comedy. We've announced a musical comedy, and we've been, because our company is very musical, and we have a permanent company, and we want to satisfy them, we want to give them something that expands their talents. So for the first time in our history, we are doing a musical comedy. I can't tell you what it is. I've been reading through 25, 30 of them. The music is wonderful. The genius of American musical theater is the music and the lyrics. It is not the book. The books are insufferable, and they always struck me as insufferable at the time, but I'm pleading a certain foresight that I don't think I had. I think all of us would agree they're insufferable now. Lady in the Dark, which has some of the most marvelous music written in the American musical theater by Kurt Weill, is referred to now as a classic of the American musical theater. Let's go back and look at it. It's about a woman who runs a magazine, and she suffers greatly. She can't relate to men, so she goes to a psychiatrist and spends 2 hours, not with a psychiatrist, but having fantasies about her past until she discovers that in an instant of revelation that something in her past, I think she wanted a boat, and she couldn't have the boat, and she's cured. That was the Broadway theater's response to psychoanalysis. It was like those movies of the 30s, remember, and the 40s, where the hero would go back and discover that when he was a child he had a skiing accident, and that takes care of all his neurosis, just like that. That was the level, really, of thought of what I think people considered a very intelligent kind of musical, as opposed to some of the others. And the fact is, they are not very good. If this is America's great contribution to the theater, then I worry for the future of American theater even more than I have been in the past. I don't think it is.
You don't feel that you should confine yourself to Chekhov, Ibsen, and Strindberg, but that you should range, as far as you want and say what you want.
I think I should say what I once challenged Walter Kerr to give up reviewing serious plays, and if he would give up reviewing serious plays, I would give up reviewing musical comedies. He didn't take me up on my challenge. But I have fun reviewing musicals sometimes. I just reviewed Cats, for example. And I found that so monstrous that I think it generated some interesting reflections on the whole nature of how money and machines have as it were, taken the place of any human encounters on the stage, if you can generalize to that effect. And I think that musical helps you do so.
Yeah, this whole notion that only serious critics should review, only serious work is crazy, if for no other reason than the tremendous importance of bad art. It's first of all, there's so much more of it, but more importantly, when people say that art has no effect on the society or no effect on the culture, they're missing the point entirely, because what they're looking at probably is high art. If they looked at all the cheap novels and B movies and television commercials and television programs and so forth, they would find that art has a tremendous effect on our society, and that serious criticism of what's going on there is important. And in fact, I think that Richards talked about this 40 years ago, that the closest thing we have to a laboratory situation to study aesthetics, to study the effect of a work of art on a person, is what we'd normally call low art, all the way down to a television commercial where you have a very quantitative measure of the effect. And it seems to me that's a worthy subject for serious attention.
Well, in the past, what we call more serious critics did used to go to the popular arts, generally to examine them sociologically. They did a sociological analysis of their what they said about the society. That, in fact, was my very first piece that I told you about, that collection of Saturday Evening Post stories. I drew some conclusions about society about them. So that's what we were doing in those days. But there is a case to be made for me not reviewing musicals and Walter Kerr not reviewing serious plays. Well, I don't want to make that bold a distinction, but it's funny that it's only in theater that that critics are asked to cover such a wide spectrum of different offerings, from the lowest brow to the highest brow. It's like Lionel Trilling, for example, reviewing not only E.M. Forster's work, but also Harold Robbins' latest production. You wouldn't think of that in the literary world. Even in the New York Times, you wouldn't assume that Christopher Lehman Haupt or Anatole Broyard would be reviewing some really pop bestseller in the same way as they would be reviewing Richard Ellman's biography of Joyce. But in the theater, we're expected to cover everything and to cover it all equally. And when the Tonys are handed out, everything is really treated equally. There's no distinction between quality and non-quality. It's just everything that just happened on Broadway.
But theater criticism, in that same way, has attracted perhaps a different kind of person than would be interested in writing about poetry or fiction. I started to say that being a more compromised form, so it's a collaborative, often commercial enterprise, perhaps it attracts more compromised individuals.
That's possible.
I mean, what I'm getting at is that there is that attraction of, well, there is the glamour and the excitement of theater, of movies, of all that means, and just as importantly, the intoxication that a critic can have of having power that he wouldn't have in another form.
Well, I will say this, and I hope it doesn't sound like sour grapes, but during that glorious period of theater criticism that, as I tried to describe earlier, attracted all those really impressive and very good minds, we were all systematically working at breaking down the walls of Broadway as a big vulgar behemoth that was preventing serious work from being created. And there was an off-Broadway movement. There was a resident theater movement beginning to evolve. There was off-Broadway. There were a number of embryonic things that were very exciting to us. Jack Gelber, the connection, was the beginning of that alternative, that option, as it were, to this juggernaut that had been rolling over everybody known as Broadway. When Broadway responded to our criticism, much to our surprise, by, for a while, lying down and dying, it really did die for a few years. It's dead now, if you think about it. It does not produce anything in the way of serious drama. There's no Arthur Millers, there's no Tennessee Williams, there's no Eugene O'Neills, there's no William Inges. Anyone with serious aspirations is really having plays done off-Broadway or in the resident theater movement, and if it's successful there, it might come to Broadway, but even that's doubtful. So it's a different kind of system. In effect, Broadway said, you're right, we don't deserve to do these serious plays, no one's going to come to see them anyway, we'll just do musicals and Neil Simon. When that happened, and as I say, there was an alternative. There were these serious theaters all around the country that needed good criticism. Those critics stopped writing. And I think they stopped writing because there was something, I knew there was myself personally, there was an extraordinary seductiveness about sitting there and punching away at this great big giant, which at the same time you enjoyed involving yourself with. You enjoyed the opening night, you enjoyed the glitter, you enjoyed the furs. You were very scornful of it, and you put it down continually, but obviously you're wrapped up in it. That's maybe what you mean by the compromised nature of the critic. When that disappeared, instead of jumping on these alternatives and not praising them, but at least looking at them and saying, you can go this way, why don't you try this playwright, all those critics disappeared. They went to the movies, or they went back to literature. They lost total interest in the theater when they had accomplished their end, which was to destroy Broadway.
Yeah, I mean, there's a terrible irony in the fact that what happened when all these alternatives became available was that the critics from Time and Newsweek and the New York Times went down to these lofts to see them, and your so-called adversary critics took a walk.
Yes, and I think, well, let me make a point about that too, which doesn't make that so positive. There's a fearful hunger in this society to turn up something new. I mean, none of us like to see the same thing done over and over again on Broadway. Broadway needs to be refreshed, just like any art form or semi-art form. And there are a large number of middle people, known as critics, I think, who are around to turn up the new, to identify it, and to write long pieces on it for mass consumption, so that larger numbers of people can respond to it, and more importantly, that it can be absorbed, as it were, into a commercial system. I think, why is Pac-Man so popular in this country, that game Pac-Man? Because I think it really sums up the whole nature of American society. What is it? It's a mouth that eats up everything and runs around eating things and runs very fast lest it be eaten, because there are other mouths after it. So this notion of absorbing other things and then being absorbed by other things, I think, well, first of all, it tells you all about these mergers that are going on in our corporate world. But more important than that, it tells you something about our art, because this serious manifestation is identified. A commercial producer comes along and sees the commercial possibilities of it, buys it, brings it onto a larger stage, and as a result has to inevitably vulgarize it or corrupt it. It becomes conventionalized. And then, of course, you have to identify the next new, exciting thing. So there are a whole bunch of cultural middlemen out there looking for the new and writing about it in order that it can be absorbed and extended to larger and larger audiences. But that, of course, has its limiting effects as well.
I once asked John Simon, when he was at a discussion like this that we had up in New Haven, after he had given a talk in which he said, as you are, that a critic must have convictions. He must have a set of values from which he writes or from which he speaks. And I asked him what those were, and he really couldn't come up with a single thing except for high standards. He believed you should have high standards, whatever that means. Let me ask you the same question, put you on the spot.
Well, I can only speak generally, of course, because the last thing in the world I would want to do is tell artists how to create their works. The critic has to be responsive. I think that's why the question is difficult to answer, because you become preemptive if you announce what your convictions, what theater has to be in order to satisfy you. You become like the Académie Française, as it were, that used to lay down a series of regulations and rules for playwrights, that every play had to take place in 24 hours and all had to be in the same place and had to follow a single unified action. And then a romantic playwright like Corneille comes along and he can't write under those restrictions. Although the critic has said, we're only going to praise those plays or allow those plays on the stage that follow those restrictions. So what he does is he crowds in the Cid, he crowds 5 years' history into one day. And that's acceptable to the Académie Française, but it's not acceptable, as it were, to a dramatic action. So my point I'm trying to make is one can't lay down rules. I can tell you what I respond to in the theater. I tell you by telling you what I don't respond to. I normally don't respond to domestic plays about marriage that take place in a kitchen. And have nothing to do with anything besides the personal problems of those two people, at which the audience peaks, as it were, without having been involved at all, being absolutely safe, because nothing is drawing them into that action except curiosity. They become peeping toms. I think the theater has to engage you, has to pull you on there, and it can't let you go. If the play is effective, it really has to affect you and your life and make you question your life. It's not going to change you in any vital or fundamental way. But if it doesn't make you question yourself, question your own values, question your marriage, question your place in society, then it's not really doing its job.
Would it be fair to say that you stand very much in the liberal humanitarian tradition of Trilling, who was one of your teachers? That basically your position is there.
That's shorthand. That's a shorthand I don't quite follow. I'd be happy to stand in the tradition of Lionel Trilling, but I'm not sure that completely sums it up as liberal humanitarian.
Well, I'm thinking mostly of the majority of your criticism, which has been collected as Seasons of Discontent, which would be, I know none of us like labels, but they certainly politically liberal, certainly aware of the social context of a play, interested in other than just the purely aesthetic or literary aspects of the work.
Yes, I think that last point is absolutely true. I don't think I responded to liberal values in plays, though. In fact, I think one of my great quarrels with Arthur Miller was that I couldn't stand the politics of it. It was too easy. It was too facile. The funny thing is that liberal thinkers, while they make very good citizens, don't make very good artists. And I was in the paradoxical position, at least in the 60s and 50s when I was writing that criticism of I think Lionel Trilling was in the same paradoxical position of acknowledging that the best writers of the time were not liberals. There were people like Eliot and Joyce and Proust and Genet and Artaud and a lot of dangerous people. And I was criticized, and I think probably quite rightly, for during the 60s, for having encouraged a kind of volatility, a kind of anarchism, a kind of anti-liberalism and anti-humanism that, in the minds of some, led to the student riots of the 60s and all those problems. And I really rethought my position on the basis of that. I think I was a little too extreme. So it would be difficult for me to characterize my own work as essentially liberal humanism, but I am a liberal humanist.
Well, and yet you're not, my own opinion, truly responsive to works of nearly pure formalism, to form and whatnot. That you are interested in the continuum of the work of art in the world.
Absolutely. But you see, I think the job of a work of art is quite different from the job of a political contract, as it were, or a piece of legislation. The job of a work of art is to give one a sense of metaphysical joy. And by joy, I'm referring to that deeper satisfaction I spoke of that you find in King Lear, to put us in touch with the deeper existential aspects of our natures, which are quite often isolated, quite often antisocial, and have their impact on social relations from that point of view. I mean, to make us aware of our own loneliness in the world. That's one of the things a work of art can do. And to appeal to certain spiritual and even, I will say it, religious aspects in our natures. So to speak of it as liberal humanism is to touch on it, but it's not really, I think, to totally sum it up.
Fair enough. All right, I've asked all the questions that I think the audience might be interested in, although not all the questions I have. And I wonder if we could throw it open maybe to the audience.
Be delighted.
And see, it's hard to see them because of all the lights.
Ah, there we are.
Okay.
Incidentally, this is not my question, but it seems to me, in your description of what you are looking for in the theater, that you're talking about what Aristotle talked about in tragedy, big universal. What is your reaction to the one-line quippers who come on the 11 o'clock news at night and give you an instantaneous reaction to a play that's just done?
We didn't even.
Some of them are very funny. I mean, they're all clever. But what do you think of this as theater critics?
It's interesting, we didn't even mention those, even though they're probably the most powerful critics in the business now. We always tend to forget them. But they do carry to this extreme that thing I was trying to say of the instant judgment, where there's nothing but the judgment. And the judgment, of course, has some pun attached to it and a few graphics in the back. But I don't know on what basis those people are permitted to criticize, outside of perhaps they have an attractive camera personality. But critics do, to be a critic, you have to have some qualifications. And I don't quite understand what those qualifications are.
Newspaper critics used to come from the sports pages and
And dine and
obituary
dance,
sections,
that's
or
right.
God knows what aspect of the paper.
They still do.
Yes.
Well, this is going from sublime to ridiculous after that, but I was curious what you think about Brendan Gill and Edith Oliver's writing in The New Yorker, and if you know anything about why Pauline Kael is allowed to make dramatic pontifications about the state of cinema, and the space that's allocated to theater is so much lesser, and is really just, I think, cut above the kind of one-liners you know.
Can I steal the first part of that question?
Sure.
Yes. Edith Oliver, as far as I can tell, does little more than give a kind of billboard notice. She says the play opened at this theater, and it's about such and such, and it was designed by such and such and directed by so and so, and doesn't offer a whole lot more in the way of criticism. That's all.
I don't know much about the New Yorker, I'm afraid. I don't mean to duck the question, but I will say frankly, I prefer not to characterize my fellow critics if I can avoid it.
I could give you his opinion, but I won't. Yes.
When you see a play, and you're impressed positively or negatively by an actor and the work that the actor does, talk to us about how you know whether it's the actor's work or the director's work. What clues that you find you have found over the years to help them?
That's the hardest thing in the world, hardest question in the world to answer, or the playwright's work. I think one has to assume it's a compound of all, that it's very hard for an actor to give a good performance without a good director. That is to say, if the actor has a bad director and the director wants the actor to go in a different direction, it's very, very difficult for the actor to resist that demand, as it were. It's also very hard for an actor to give a performance in a play that the character that doesn't have some quality, using language that doesn't have some overtones to it. So I think it's virtually impossible to separate out what goes into making a powerful performance, and I would prefer always to speak of it as a collective experience. I think the worst thing, we all do it, but I would try to refrain, for a number of reasons, from singling out certain actors for praise or opprobrium. Particularly for praise, it's one of the worst things you can do to an actor, because if you bring an actor to public attention, you're taking him or her really out of the theater. You're sending him to television or the movies.
Was it Kenneth Tynan who had the great line about the Himalayas?
Oh, it was Danny Kaye.
That
was a typical, I think that sums up the judgmental kind of criticism. When Danny Kaye was asked in one of his movies how he liked the Himalayas, he said, loved him, hated her. So I think of this criticism as loved him, hated her kind of criticism.
Yes.
How do you think off-Broadway is changing, and do you think it's taking up the slack that...
Opera?
Off-Broadway.
Off-Broadway.
Is it getting better or worse, or taking up the slack overall?
Yes, off-Broadway has become the serious adjunct to Broadway, whereas it used to be having more experimental thrust in the American theater. Now it's gotten a little conventionalized and a little middlebrow. Whereas off-Broadway, in reaction to off-Broadway's conventionalization, has over the years been trying to be more experimental and more adventurous. However, I will say that it seems that whatever passes for a serious play today does happen not on Broadway, but in off-Broadway or in the resident theaters. That's where the serious plays are being produced. New plays.
The question next to the last question.
I have two non-related questions. One is, you mentioned prodigious note-taking. Do you feel when you're taking notes on the details that you may be missing some overall whatever, and do you have total or semi-recall, and do you stop immediately afterwards, not do anything else, but spend 3 or 4 days on a particular play that you saw in order to write about it? That's one part of the question. The other part is whether or not, how you feel about whether there's a need to have a National American Theater, and if so, when, where, how, and why.
Well,
Good
to
question.
answer your first question, I sharpen my pencils before I go to the theater. And actually, I'm able to write, since I can't read my own writing anyway, I'm able to write without looking at the pad. The writing isn't anything I'm going to consult. If I can read it, I'll consult it, but normally I can't read it. The writing is an effort to keep my brain working and to keep me focused on the stage. For example, let me tell you quite frankly that when I began writing criticism, I was aware that I had a serious deficiency. I had no visual sense. I would often walk into a living room and not know what color the living room was or whether there were 2 chairs or 3 chairs. And I had to train myself, because I value design and what it can do in the theater, to look. And in order to train myself to do that, I wrote down what I was seeing, or else I wouldn't have remembered it. What the found objects, what the decor was like. In the same way, I would write dialogue. or I would write a reflection, a reaction to what I was seeing. It's partly an attempt to keep myself from coming into this Wagnerian miasma, which should be a strong emotional experience in the theater, because then I won't think about it. And at the same time, because the difficult thing is to give yourself up to that. It's very important that you respond emotionally. It's very important you applaud too. I can't stand these critics that grab their coats and run out, even though they're weekly critics. They have no place to go. But they're running around as if they've got to make a deadline and write this in 2 hours. I mean, if you've had a good experience in the theater, you should respond to it like anyone else and applaud. Your second question?
National Theater.
No, I rarely write immediately afterwards. I have at least a day and sometimes a week before I sit down and write, so I have time to ruminate.
He has a word processor now, so
I have a terrific toy, which is a word processor. I have a stock answer for that, and it goes like this, that we can't have a national theater until we have a nation. That we are too divided, too fragmented, too non-generalized in this country to establish one theater in one place that's going to serve the entire nation. I mean, there are so many different needs, ethnic needs, sexual needs, racial needs, that one theater can't satisfy them all. I think the way one establishes a national theater, as you like, is for each major city and some of the minor ones to have its own theater, and for that theater to be a strong part of that particular community. A theater can't, in a mass society like our own, a theater cannot cater to 220, 30 million people satisfactorily. It has to function, that's its advantage. It doesn't have to be the movies. It can function in relation vis-a-vis a smallish audience.
Yes, sir.
Shouldn't there be at least more than one level of critics and criticism? The mass of the people don't go to see Ibsen, Strindberg, or even O'Neill, but a great many more go to see a lot less sophisticated intellectual work. How do you satisfy the needs there? Satisfy that, so to speak, lesser intellectual level? Who does like to go out, does like to go to the theater, maybe more often than the others?
By the New York Post.
I don't satisfy them, but they are being satisfied. Well, it's true. There are critics, and of course there's the theater itself that satisfies these people. Like that.
In a sense, you criticize online as a television, but they do serve a purpose to watch it.
Sure.
We look forward to this kind of instant pop criticism.
And none of us, even if I express a certain reaction to the typical American musical theater, I am not stating that in order to prevent people from having their fun. I believe in a pluralistic culture, a pluralistic society. It is just my own interest that's being expressed here. And I think most people will continue to go to Broadway for their popular satisfactions, their popular entertainment, and as they'll go to rock concerts for their pop music. The problem is not maintaining those entertainments. The problem is maintaining in what is essentially, let's face it, a Philistine culture. The United States still is a Philistine culture. It's still very retrograde compared with other countries of the world. To maintain a serious culture here, to maintain the capacity for serious music, new music, and classical music to be supported and maintained by the culture, for serious theater. I mean, it's a great reservoir of plays that are very rarely done, just as there's a really large reservoir of important new plays that are not being done. Theaters have to attend to these, and they need the support of audiences in order to do it. Same thing with the art world. I mean, there's all kinds of art. And one of the glories of our country is that all these things can be available, but one of the problems of our country is the more serious expressions, which are poor and don't have the kind of support and are not commercial, which means they don't attract a lot of money through the box office, to find some way to preserve those and maintain those until we grow up as a country.
Let's take something from Frank. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to pose a question which both of you sort of dealt in one way or another, but it relates to your function as a director as well as a critic. You find that as a director, as you write criticism and then you direct, is the quality of thought the same or is it different? Are there two different mentalities at work?
I think they're completely different. Two completely compartmentalized things. there's one thing is similar, and that is giving yourself up to an author. If you're dealing with a play as a director, and let's say it's a play by Ibsen. I recently did Ghosts. What you do is you investigate that play and investigate it and exhume it and plumb it, so you can get below the surface that everyone has seen and everyone associates with that particular play, and try and find out what's going on down there in the subterranean depths. That has an analytical cast to it, a critical cast, if you like, even a scholar's cast. I mean, you read a lot about what's been said about the play, but more important, you read it over and over again in order to experience it. But coming up with a design or a concept for that production is almost a mystical thing. It is not an analytical thing. It's nothing you'd want to use in your criticism. I mean, I used to sit and, when I was preparing production, I would go try and find a lovely architectural atmosphere to sit in, like Beinecke Library at Yale used to be a source of inspiration. It's a place where I think it's made out of onyx, but there's light coming through it in very strange ways. And sit and think about the play in that particular atmosphere, ruminate on it, and something would click and I would come up with, hopefully, with a concept. But that's not a critic's job. I think that's more a mystic's work.
Yes.
We seem to be living in a more visual, physical, non-verbal world, and there seems to be like two tendencies in language and theory that are throw out of the sort of ensemble created bookless theater, or in scripted theater, sort of domestic usage of language. How do you see language used in the theater of the future? Have we lost the poetry? Will it be sort of supplementary, or how do you see it?
Well, I still think the playwright is supreme in the theater, and although I've seen some very good performance group work, the best of it has been connected, if only tangentially, to a good writer. The work that I found least satisfying, and that I think even the people that are most excited about it at the time would find least satisfying, are the pieces in which they threw out the playwright to the tumbrils with a wordsmith, as Kenneth Tynan said, and got up there and made it up themselves. And what you got was some wonderful group encounters and group improvisations and what have you, but it really doesn't add up to anything lasting that you can carry away with you. Whereas I think the experience you have of an important and exciting collective working on behalf of a playwright to realize that vision, that will continue, I think, to be the lasting experience of the theater. Theater can't be without language.
Way back there.
You mentioned that you hesitate to praise actors who fear that they will go into television. Could you speak a little more about the effect of television on live theater?
It's only had a malign effect on live theater, unless you mean the use of television in the theater, not video techniques. You mean television itself. It's had a malevolent effect on the theater. First of all, it's had a malevolent effect on all of us. It's I'm referring, of course, to the typical network evening. It's taken perfectly good actors, some marvelous actors, and it's stuck them in a fatuous character, which they are required to repeat week after week. And it's that character that the viewer, tired viewer, sits and watches with the over and over again and responds to, as an act of recognition. But the actor is unable to break out of this prison of this idiot character that has been formulated according to a laugh track. And as a result, what you see is, I see anyway, the disintegration of an actor's soul before my eyes when I'm watching these people perform in those things.
Many of you may know that Henry Winkler was a student at the Yale School of Drama, an actor in the Yale Repertory Theater before he became Fonzie.
And poor Henry, who really was a good actor, poor Henry is, he's very happy in many ways, but he came back to the drama school and expressed what seemed to me an extremely tragic sense of not being recognized as Henry Winkler. He was recognized everywhere as the Fonz. He had been absorbed, it reminded me of a horror movie, the great blob. The blob comes along and absorbs everything. He'd been absorbed inside this character, and Henry continued to try to make a movie here or do a Shakespeare here or appear in a play here, and he couldn't break out of this. They all came to see the Fonz, and there he is, tragically transfixed as the Fonz. It's like that Marceau character. Remember Marcel Marceau used to do this clown, with a smile on his face, and he couldn't change his face, and he tried to get his mask off, and he couldn't get it off. The mask was stuck to his face, and Fonz's mask is stuck to Henry Winkler's face.
Yes.
I would like to ask you a question as an educator. You mentioned that serious music and serious playwrights are having a hard time because they can't get their things on boards or heard. I think you also have a problem with the fact that audiences are not being educated. We have younger audiences who don't understand the aesthetics of film or plays or whatever, because by the time they get to it, it's too late for them. They haven't had the critical thinking started early on in their education. Has there been in the curriculum, in terms of drama and theater curriculum, any thought toward giving courses in critical thinking criteria on amateur plays or plays that would lead up to a stage, in elementary school?
There's been a lot of thought, and there was even a book written by David Rockefeller Jr. recently called Coming to Our Senses, in which was a very impassioned and quite moving plea for art education in the elementary school. Of course, that's where it's going to start. If I go up to Harvard and realize that 99/100ths of those very intelligent students have never seen a serious play. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it's a large proportion. You're introducing them to this for the first time. However, as you know, education is in sore economic straits at the moment. As you also know, whenever the money is short, what do? You fire the music teacher. So they fired all the music teachers and the theater teachers and the art teachers, and what you've got is the same old reading, writing, and arithmetic, and there's no effort really to humanize or to create an artistic atmosphere for the students, and they're desperate for it.
The second half of this is, what is your opinion about having plays televised and put on so that the masses can see them and get into the theater, although they're seeing them in cameo performances? What's your feeling about it?
Well, I'm very much in favor of it, and I don't think they have to be cameo performances. They are developing techniques now, and I think it's essential to the televising of a play, where you will not think this has been done in a studio, where it's not been done, but you have the grit and the muscle and the sweat of actually the theater itself. You must not forget you're in the theater, and indeed there must be an audience there as well, and the audience responds so that you're not absorbed into an illusion, but you recognize you're in a theater, because that's the beauty of the theater, that you know you're in a theater relating to a live actor and not being hypnotized. And there are some very good techniques being experimented with, which will, especially now with Capel and the effort to bring the works of that have, serious works that have come to public attention, to bring them to a larger audience. It's also crucial to the survival of any number of theaters, because that's going to be a source of economic nourishment over the next few years as the other sources dry up.
Over there.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work over the past 5-10 years with Rocco Landesman theater group, and one of the things that I found to be most impressive about and the possibility of getting production down with Black and Hispanic groups all over the country, not just in New York, is that there seems to be an audience for those kinds of issues being raised in social justice, but as long as it's removed from
always beware when you go to the theater of a situation in which you find yourself feeling superior to the characters on the stage. If you know more than they do, and the whole thrust of the production is to bring them up to your level of awareness, you're in the presence of something that's not worth seeing, of an inferior work.
Children of a lesser God.
Yeah, Children of a Lesser God is an perfect example. And most of our theater, particularly our semi-serious commercial theater, is set up in a way to make you feel superior to what you're watching, and quite smug and complacent about being yourself. And I think that's true whether it's a racial subject or a domestic subject or a subject about the handicapped or what have you.
Way in the back.
Speaking of inferior product, do you have any theory to account for the sudden impulse of Broadway audiences to leap to their feet and give a stand ovation to every mediocre play and act? And you have any suggestions for something different to do with its really quality because it belongs to them?
That's a wonderful question. I've been wondering about that myself. I've been speculating there's some sort of itching powder on the seats. Something is getting them up. What is the reason for that?
Yes.
Yes, I know. It's a very. I thought I got away with that one about Amazon.
Almost.
I think dance, of all the performing arts, normally has the least content. That it is more form than content. Again, is a very personal prejudice, and it does not cover the great choreography, the great dance work, but much dance, being so formalized and being so abstract, leaves you sitting watching the ripple of muscles, watching people who can do things that you can't do, and you're responding more to the, as it were, to the Olympic nature of it. Than you are to what it's telling you about yourself. And I keep insisting that performing arts one of their functions should be to tell you about yourself. And I think dance does this less often than theater, although it's much more technically perfect.
Shall we take one more question? Okay.
You seem to have an ongoing essay about keeping your serious theater for yourself and intellectuals who enjoy the intellectualism. Perhaps if your talents were used to explain this commercial theater a little more, the people who are more open to it, they might be led on to enjoy this great serious theater you're talking about.
I've tried to devote a large part of my life to that. I am, as you mentioned, an educator as well as a director and a critic. And my great hope is to, if I can, to expose to those people who do not have the joy of it, as many as possible, the great joy of the experience of a serious, important play.
You write for a little magazine, and you enjoy that apparently, with no hope of going beyond it.
Well,
Well, you have written for bigger magazines.
I've written for bigger magazines. But I do have a worry, as I think I told you, about what happens to your capacity to. Well, I think the bigger the magazine you write for, the less able you are to say what you think is the truth. I think your truth is going to be modified. But I do teach students. I've taught a number of generations of students about plays that they hadn't read before, and I hope excited some of them about the possibilities of those plays. And I will continue to do so because I believe that that's where the hope of all of us lies. It's in a more universalized, extended, and imaginative group of young people, because I think we're hopeless cases when we get to our age, but they still have possibility, and we have to continue to believe in their possibility. But I don't think I can teach them very well if I teach them on television. I have to teach them in a 1-1 relationship. I mean, by 1-1, I mean 1 to maybe 100 or 150. But without that, my effectiveness is going to be dimmed. And I think the same thing is probably true. I'm saying the same thing is true of the theater. Theater ultimately is a minority art. It cannot effectively appeal to more than, at most 1,200, 1,500 people at one time. That's also its great virtue. because it is an art that deals with a collective, not just the collective on the stage, but the collective in the audience. And we keep forgetting to talk about the audience, without which there is no theater. There's a movie without an audience, but there's no theater without an audience. And our hope is, in our divided culture, that if we can establish a community inside this small collective, similar to the one we're in tonight, then there's hope for creating a community externally in our country. That's why some of us, I think, continue to commit ourselves to this problematical form for all its problems and for all its minority appeal.
Well, thank you, Bob. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Rocco. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.